Umuokwe village was known for its traditions. At the center of the village stood the ekoro, a big, sacred drum made from an ancient tree. The villagers believed that the drum could talk to the spirits of their ancestors, and only the elders played it during special ceremonies. Nnadi was a young man who loved music. He played the smaller drums at village festivals, but he always dreamed of playing the ekoro. The deep sound of the drum fascinated him, and he wondered what it would feel like to make it speak. One day, after a festival, Nnadi stayed behind while everyone else left. The sacred drum sat alone, its surface smooth and inviting. Temptation got the best of him. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then picked up the drumsticks. Just a little, he whispered to himself. Nnadi struck the drum gently, and the deep, echoing sound filled the air. Excited, he hit it again, harder this time. The sound traveled far, bouncing off the trees and returning like an answer. But then, something strange happened. The echoes of the drum began to change. It sounded like someone else was beating the drum from the forest, faster and louder. Nnadi's heart pounded. He tried to stop, but the sound wouldn't stop. It grew louder and angrier. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and Nnadi felt as if many eyes were watching him from the shadows. The trees seemed to move closer, their leaves whispering angrily as Nnadi began to appear in different locations. "Who beats the sacred drum without permission?" a voice boomed from nowhere. Nnadi froze. His hands shook, and the drumsticks fell to the ground. He looked around, but there was no one there. The wind stopped, and the forest became silent. Fear seized him, and he ran home, leaving the drum behind. That night, Nnadi couldn't sleep. He heard the sound of drum beats, faint but steady, echoing from the forest. It sounded angry, like a warning. He covered his ears, but the sound continued. The next morning, the village woke up to shocking news. The sacred drum, the ekoro, was found cracked down the middle. The elders were furious and afraid. They knew the spirits were angry, but they didn't know why. The villagers gathered under the big tree, whispering and pointing fingers. The elders called for Dibia Ojidai, the village's spiritual leader. Ojidai arrived with his charms and began a ritual to speak with the spirits. After a long silence, Ojidai spoke. "Someone has disrespected the spirits by beating the sacred drum without permission. If the person does not confess, the spirits will bring misfortune upon us all." Fear spread across the village. Nnadi's heart pounded, but he kept quiet. He wondered what the spirits would do if they found out it was him. That night, the drum beats returned, louder, angrier, and impossible to ignore. The trees outside Nnadi's hut rustled violently, and whispers floated in the air. It was clear that the spirits were watching, waiting for a confession. Nnadi knew that his mistake had awakened something dangerous, and the spirits would not rest until they were appeased. The village of Umuokwe was restless. Ever since the ekoro, the sacred drum, was found broken, strange things began to happen. The stream that provided the village's water became muddy and undrinkable. Animals fell sick, and some died without reason. Crops began to dry up, even though the rainy season had just begun. People were afraid. They whispered that the spirits of the forest were angry. Every night, the sound of drum beats echoed from the forest, loud, angry, and unending. No one dared to go near the forest after sunset. The elders gathered once again under the old tree. Dibia Ojidai, the village's spiritual leader, was called to help. He sat quietly, staring at the cracked drum. After a long silence, he spoke. "The spirits demand the truth. If the person who broke the law does not confess, the whole village will suffer." Everyone looked at each other nervously. No one wanted to admit anything. Nnadi's heart pounded. He knew he had done wrong, but the thought of admitting it terrified him. What if the village turned against him? What if the spirits punished him harshly? That night, the drum beats were louder than ever. They filled the air, shaking the walls of Nnadi's hut. He covered his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his own head. The wind outside howled, and voices whispered his name. "Nnadi, Nnadi. He couldn't take it anymore. Fear and guilt crushed him. Early the next morning, before the sun fully rose, Nnadi went to Dibia Ojidai's shrine. Ojidai sat cross-legged, his eyes closed, as if he had been expecting him. Nnadi fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Father, it was me," he cried. "I beat the sacred drum. I didn't mean any harm. I was just curious." Ojidai opened his eyes slowly, his gaze heavy. He nodded sadly. "The spirits already know, my son. Now, the village must know." Ojidai gathered the elders and the villagers under the big tree. Nnadi stood before them, his head hung low, his body trembling. Ojidai spoke of Nnadi's confession, and the villagers gasped. Some looked at him with anger, others with disappointment. "The spirits require a sacrifice to calm their anger," Ojidai announced. "Without it, the suffering will continue." The villagers began to murmur. What kind of sacrifice would satisfy the spirits? Would it be an animal or something more? Nnadi's heart pounded. What if the spirits wanted his life? Ojidai continued, "Tonight, we will gather at the forest edge and ask the spirits what they demand. Nnadi, you must be there." That night, as the moon shone brightly, the villagers gathered near the forest. Ojidai stood at the front, chanting prayers and calling to the spirits. The air was thick and heavy. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, and the drum beats returned, loud, angry, and terrifying. A voice echoed from the forest, deep and powerful. "The one who broke the law must pay. A sacrifice must be made. A life for a life." Fear spread through the crowd. Nnadi's heart sank. The spirits wanted his life in exchange for the peace of the village. Tears filled his eyes as he realized the weight of his mistake. The villagers looked at Nnadi, some with pity, others with relief that it wasn't them. Nnadi knew that he had no choice. If he did not agree, the village would continue to suffer. The spirits had spoken, and the price had to be paid. The news of the spirits' demand spread quickly. The village was heavy with sadness and fear. Mothers held their children tightly, and the elders prayed for mercy. Everyone knew that Nnadi's mistake had brought this upon them, but no one expected the price to be so high, a life for a life. Nnadi stayed in his hut, too ashamed and frightened to face the villagers. His mother sat beside him, her eyes red from crying. His younger brother and sister huddled nearby, silent and scared. "Mama, I'm sorry," Nnadi whispered. "I didn't know this would happen." His mother placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "It is a heavy mistake, my son, but the spirits must be respected." Later that day, the elders visited Nnadi. They spoke gently, but their words carried a firm message. The spirits had demanded a sacrifice, and if Nnadi refused, the village would continue to suffer. "Tomorrow night, we will perform the sacrifice," one elder said. "Prepare yourself, Nnadi." That night, Nnadi could not sleep. The drum beats returned, loud and unforgiving, echoing from the forest. It felt as if the spirits were reminding him of the price he must pay. His heart ached with fear, but he knew what had to be done. The next evening, as the sun set, the villagers gathered at the edge of the forest. The air was thick and heavy, and the trees seemed to lean closer, as if watching. Dibia Ojidai stood at the front, dressed in white with charms around his neck. A fire burned brightly, casting shadows that danced like spirits. Nnadi stepped forward, his legs trembling. The villagers watched in silence. Some whispered prayers, while others wiped away tears. Ojidai began to chant, calling upon the spirits to hear their plea. "O spirits of the forest, we bring the one who broke your law. We offer this sacrifice to calm your anger and restore peace to our village." The drum beats began, echoing from the forest, loud, steady, and powerful. The sound filled Nnadi's ears, heavy and endless. He felt a cold breeze sweep through the gathering, and the shadows seemed to close in on him. Then a voice, deep and echoing, boomed from the darkness. "The price has been paid. The village shall be spared." The drum beat stopped suddenly, and a heavy silence fell. The fire flickered, and the cold wind disappeared. The villagers looked around, unsure if it was truly over. Ojidai stepped forward and placed a hand on Nnadi's shoulder. "It is done, my son," he said softly. "The spirits have accepted the sacrifice." Nnadi's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, tears streaming down his face. Relief and regret mixed within him. The village was safe, but the burden of his mistake would remain with him forever. From that day on, the village of Umuokwe slowly healed. The stream ran clear again, the crops grew tall, and the animals became healthy. The drum beats no longer haunted the village, and the whispers from the forest faded away. But Nnadi never forgot the sound of the ekoro or the spirit's anger. He lived each day remembering the price of disobedience and the power of the sacred drum. For a while, everything seemed to return to normal in Umuokwe. The villagers believed that the spirits were satisfied and that their troubles were over. The crops flourished, the animals were healthy again, and the stream ran clear. Life moved on, but Nnadi still carried the weight of his mistake. He avoided the forest and the spot where the ekoro once stood. The sound of any drum made his heart race, reminding him of that night, the night he broke the sacred law. But soon, strange things began to happen again. At night, villagers heard the faint sound of drum beats coming from the forest. It was different this time, softer, sadder, but still unsettling. Shadows moved among the trees, and whispers floated in the air, calling Nnadi's name. Children who played near the edge of the forest came back frightened, claiming they saw figures moving between the trees. An old hunter went missing while checking his traps, and when they found his body days later, his face was frozen in terror. Fear spread through the village once more. The elders gathered, worried that the spirits had returned. Dibia Ojidai was called again to understand what was happening. He entered his shrine and spent hours consulting the spirits. When he emerged, his face looked troubled. "The spirits are not satisfied," he announced. "They say the wrongs of the past cannot be easily washed away." The villagers grew anxious. Some began to whisper that Nnadi's mistake had left a permanent stain on the village. Others believed that the spirits wanted more than just a sacrifice, they wanted to be remembered, respected, and feared. That night, the drum beats returned, louder than ever. It seemed as if the whole forest was alive, echoing with the angry sound. Nnadi lay awake, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, and he heard his name clearly. "Nnadi! Nnadi! Why did you wake us?" Cold sweat covered his body. He sat up and saw shadows moving outside his hut. Dark figures with hollow eyes stared at him through the window. Their faces looked twisted and angry, and they beat invisible drums with their ghostly hands. Nnadi screamed, and his family rushed in. The shadows vanished, but the drum beat still echoed in his ears. The next day, the village elders gathered at his hut, worried that the spirits would not stop until their anger was fully calmed. "Please, elders," Nnadi begged, tears in his eyes. "What more can I do? I am sorry. I am truly sorry." Dibia Ojidai spoke, his voice heavy. "The spirits must be properly honored. The ekoro must be remade, and a great ceremony held. Only then can we hope for peace." The villagers agreed. They gathered wood from the sacred forest, carefully chosen with Ojidai's guidance. Skilled carvers worked tirelessly, shaping the new drum to resemble the old one. The day of the ceremony was set, and the entire village prepared to ask for forgiveness once again. When the day came, the villagers gathered at the edge of the forest. The new ekoro stood tall and proud. Ojidai began the ritual, chanting prayers and calling to the spirits. Nnadi stepped forward, kneeling before the drum. "Spirits of the forest, I am sorry," he cried. "I beg for your mercy. Let our village find peace again." The drum beats began, but this time they were not angry. They were slow, steady, and deep. The wind blew softly, and the shadows in the forest seemed to retreat. The whispers faded, and a calm silence fell over the village. The ceremony ended, and the villagers returned home with hope in their hearts. Nnadi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the spirits had finally accepted their plea. But as night fell, a single drumbeat echoed from the forest, deep, strong, and lonely. Nnadi paused, his heart racing. Were the spirits truly satisfied, or was there more yet to come? After the ceremony, the village of Umuokwe finally felt a sense of peace. The crops grew, animals thrived, and the stream remained clear. Nnadi tried to rebuild his life, but the memory of the spirit's anger never left him. For many months, there were no drum beats from the forest. The villagers believed that the spirits had forgiven them. Laughter returned to the village, and the fear of the forest began to fade. But as the harvest season approached, the drum beats returned, deep, loud, and relentless. This time, it wasn't just at night. The beats could be heard at all hours, echoing through the village and bouncing off the trees. It was as if the forest itself was speaking. People became frightened again. Children woke up crying, saying they saw shadows dancing around their beds. Elders heard whispers of their names, and some villagers fell ill with strange, unexplainable fevers. Dibia Ojidai was called once more. He entered his shrine, staying inside for hours. When he finally emerged, his face was pale and his eyes wide with fear. The spirits are not satisfied, he declared. They do not seek forgiveness, they seek justice. A heavy silence fell over the village. What more could they do? Hadn't they rebuilt the drum and performed the ceremony? Why were the spirits still angry? Ojida explained that the spirits did not just want a new drum or a ceremony, they wanted true respect. The careless act of beating the Ekoro had woken restless spirits, some who had long desired revenge. Now, they wanted something more. The spirits demand that the forest be respected forever, Ojida continued. No one must cut its trees without permission. No one must enter its depths without purpose. The spirits have made the forest their home. The villagers agreed, too fearful to disobey. They marked the edge of the forest with charms, warning everyone to respect the land and its spirits. Nnadi lived the rest of his life carefully, never forgetting the sound of the angry drum beats. Whenever he passed the forest, he would lower his head and whisper a prayer, asking for peace. The villagers shared his caution, and the forest became a place of mystery and respect.